Mr. President, I'd like to take a few moments here in the Senate to pay tribute to a remarkable woman. Maggie Daley served with dignity and grace for 22 years as Chicago's First Lady. She died on Thanksgiving evening after a nearly decade-long struggle with breast cancer. She was at home, surrounded by her loving family. There is a sad but fitting poignancy to the date. People in Chicago and far beyond have so many reasons to be thankful for the life of this exceptional woman. Maggie Daley was an adopted daughter of Chicago, but no native-born Chicagoan could have loved the city more or served it better. Last May, as her husband Rich prepared to step down as Chicago's mayor, the Chicago Tribune ran an article about what Maggie Daley had meant to Chicago. The first paragraph really put it well, and I quote, "There's never been and may never be a Chicago First Lady of greater impact, influence, and inspiration than Maggie Daley." Maggie was smart, funny, tireless, amazingly modest, and deeply compassionate. She was also a very private person, yet she still managed to touch the lives of so many people. The love Chicagoans feel for Maggie Daley was reflected in the faces of the people who waited in line this last Sunday, over a block long in the rain, to attend her wake at the Chicago Cultural Center, incidentally a building which she worked hard to restore. I stood in that line and talked to many people. Some of them I knew from my public life and their public lives, but many just private citizens, some of whom had met her briefly, some had worked with her for years, but they all came to pay tribute to her. Among them was Hazel Holt, 74 years old. Chicago Tribune described Mrs. Holt as a person who decided to drive downtown in her church finery from the Gresham neighborhood on the south side, pay for parking, take a bus, then walk on a damp, chilly November day to stand in line for the wake. Mrs. Holt said that Maggie Daley, quote, "built connections to the city's people with her commitment to charities assisting children, as well as her public poise in the face of cancer that would claim her life." She then went on to say to the reporter, "I just love this lady. I wish I had 1/4 of her grace. She was a role model for a lot of us." That's a feeling shared by many of us in Chicago and beyond. Upon hearing of Maggie's death, Nancy Brinker, the founder and CEO of the Susan G. Komen Foundation for the Cure, said, "We've lost a real general." Loretta and I were blessed to have known Maggie personally, and Rich has been my friend, my colleague, even my boss for decades. Yesterday morning, I attended Maggie's funeral at the Old St. Patrick's Church, our neighborhood parish in Chicago. I remember the last Mass that I had attended there with Maggie and Rich Daley. It was St. Patrick's Day. It's a big day in Chicago on St. Patrick's Day, and ground zero for the celebration, Old St. Pat's. It was clear that Maggie's health was flagging. She had to sit through most of the service. She came to the front pew in a wheelchair. But all of those struggles were quickly forgotten as her grandkids, children and grandkids, were seated next to her, and we heard from the back of the church after the Mass that sound we all waited for, the famous Shannon Rovers Bagpipe Band from the Bridgeport section of Chicago. And they come marching up the center aisle with those bagpipes blasting. It is a moment you'll never forget. Well, Maggie's grandkids were nervously waiting, expectantly waiting for the sound of the bagpipes scrambling all over the pew and all over Maggie and Rich to get to the point where they could peer out down the center aisle to watch the bagpipers come away. I looked at Maggie and Rich at that moment, and I saw them beaming with the kind of joy that loving parents and grandparents just live for. Maggie was a patron saint of social causes, but her deepest convictions were to God and her family. Maggie and Rich Daley have been blessed with 4 children, Patrick, Nora, Kevin, and Lally. Years ago, she made her husband keep a promise to reserve Sundays exclusively for private family time. So the bottom line was this: you could ask Mayor Daley 6 days of the week to go anywhere in Chicago or anywhere else, but Sunday, no way. He made a promise to Maggie, that was family day. It's a promise he always kept, and we respected. 2 weeks ago, the family announced that their youngest daughter, Lally, had moved the date of her wedding from New Year's Eve to mid-November so that Maggie could attend. It was a signal that the end was near. But she was at that wedding, in her wheelchair with her irrepressible smile, a beaming mother celebrating her daughter's happiness, quintessential Maggie Daley. Part of the reason Maggie found such joy in life is that she understood what a fragile gift life was. In 1981, her third child, Kevin, died from spina bifida, just months shy of his third birthday. After Kevin's death, she found healing and meaning in reaching out to help others, and especially in volunteering to work for kids with disabilities. Someone once called her the godmother of all Chicago's children. Mayor Rahm Emanuel said on her passing, Mayor Rich Daley may have been the head of the city, but Maggie Daley was the heart of Chicago. In 1991, Maggie and Lois Weisberg, Chicago's longtime commissioner of cultural affairs and an icon in her own right, began something called Gallery 37. It was an abandoned piece of real estate in the middle of downtown Chicago that had been lost in legal and court battles for decades, and she decided, with Lois, to set up a tent on this old plot of land that was sitting vacant and create Gallery 37, which was an art gallery for kids. So all across Chicago, they invited kids, grade school and high school kids, to submit their artwork. And we all went down there for the joy of that moment and seeing the kids, the pride they had, and some of the magnificent artwork that they produced, all because Maggie and Lois decided here was an opportunity they couldn't miss. The program later morphed or matured into an amazing program called After School Matters. Maggie thought, if I can occupy these kids with art and music and drama and theater and chorus during the school year, let's do it after school, a vulnerable time for many kids. So over 2 decades, Maggie Daley nurtured the artistic talents of thousands of Chicago high school students and became a model for programs in many cities across the country and as far away as London and Australia. The last time Maggie was in this building was in my office to come upstairs and to sit and lobby me for money for After School Matters. Needless to say, she won my vote and my support. Maggie Daley believed that art could change lives. She believed that artistic talent could exist in children from the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago as surely as it could from children in better, more wealthy neighborhoods, and that all the young people should have the opportunity to develop their talents together. That's why After School Matters has become such an amazing program. Maggie Daley also served on the auxiliary board of the Art Institute and the women's board of the Rehab Institute of Chicago. She was a very busy person. It was a happy accident that she came to Chicago. Margaret Ann Corbett Daley was born and grew up in a suburb of Pittsburgh. She was the youngest of Patrick and Elizabeth Corbett's 7 kids and their only girl. After graduating in 1965 from the University of Dayton, she entered a management training program for Xerox, and her job took her to Chicago. She promised her dad she was just going to stay in Chicago for 2 years and then come back to Pittsburgh. But in 1970, she met a young attorney named Rich Daley at a Christmas party, and they decided to date, got engaged, married for nearly 40 years. Now, the average survival rate for Maggie's form of breast cancer that has spread beyond the breast and lymph nodes is very brief. Maggie Daley lived with this incurable illness for 9 years. Her doctors called it a medical miracle. She endured years of painful treatment and faced her cancer with courage, dignity, grace, and good humor. As the cancer progressed, she relied on crutches, a walker, and eventually even a wheelchair. But the smile never quit. She donated generously to help open the Maggie Daley Center for Women's Cancer Care at Northwestern Hospital last year. The center helps other women facing cancer by providing access to doctors and important support services. Loretta and I obviously offer our deepest condolences to Rich Daley, his wonderful children and their families, all the Daley children and grandchildren. We trust that time and treasured memories will ease the great sorrow that they obviously feel. They can also take comfort in knowing that the legacy of Margaret Corbett Daley can be seen and felt all over the adopted city she loved. Maggie Daley's dedication to the arts will continue in part through the work of her daughters, Nora Daley Conroy, who chairs Chicago's Cultural Affairs Advisory Committee, and of course, Lally, who will continue in her mom's tradition. Her commitment to education will live on in the lives of the young people she's touched. Her courage will endure in the women she inspired, who can now find medical care at the center she helped establish. Maggie Daley was a modest person. She didn't like to talk about herself. She preferred speaking of others. 2 years after she was diagnosed with cancer, however, she gave an interview to the Chicago Sun-Times in which she hinted about how she felt about her future. This is what she said, and I quote, "I try not to waste any time. At the end of the day, what's important is if you think that the people around you have maybe had a better day because of some of the things you've done." Well, by that standard and so many others, Maggie Daley lived a good and full life. She did much good, and she will be greatly missed.